The Varath called it a tithe. We called it Tuesday. I was sitting in the joint operations room of the Orion station when the latest diplomatic packet arrived. 14 pages of formatted agreements, resource allocation tables, and territory transfer maps, all stamped with the Varath seal, a golden ring eating its own tail. I had been staring at that seal for 6 years. I had stopped being impressed by it sometime around year 1. The room smelled like recycled air and cold protein rations. It always did. 12 species sat around a curved table long enough to land a shuttle on, each with their own translator device, each with their own particular flavor of nervous energy that translated perfectly across species and biology. Fear, it turned out, was universal. The Varath had spent 400 years proving that point in increasingly thorough ways. I was the human military observer. That was my official title. It meant I sat in the chair closest to the door, received no direct address from the senior delegates, and was handed the diplomatic packets last, after the Keth, after the Solari Collective, after the Branathi and the Orath, and the 6 other species who had been part of this alliance considerably longer than humanity had been part of any conversation that mattered. I was an afterthought with a rank insignia and a bad coffee habit. I poured myself another cup from the station dispenser. It tasted the way coffee tastes when a machine has had the concept described to it by a second machine that also had only heard about it secondhand. I drank it anyway, because bad coffee is still coffee, and I had learned a long time ago not to waste energy being precious about the things I needed to function. The Varath representative on the wall screen was called High Administrator Ven. He had been in this role for 11 years, which in Varath terms meant he had successfully processed the formal surrender of 4 independent systems without causing a diplomatic incident that required escalation. He was good at his job. That was the most terrifying thing about him. He was not cruel in any theatrical way. He did not threaten with raised voice or dramatic gesture. He presented terms the way a very competent accountant presents a quarterly loss report, with the calm certainty that the numbers do not lie. Arguing with them is emotional rather than rational, and the sensible path forward is simply to acknowledge what the numbers say and begin adjusting accordingly. Today's packet was standard. The Varath were requesting. That was always the word. Requesting preferential access to the Dalari Belt mining operations, which had been producing valuable mineral compounds under joint species management for 12 years. In exchange, they were offering a 5-year extension on the non-interference agreement that currently provided formal protection to 3 colony worlds in the Outer Rim territories. The math was clean, the language was professional, the underlying implication was the same one it always was, stated nowhere in the document and present in every line of it. Comply, or the 5-year extension becomes no extension at all. I watched the Keth ambassador read through the packet. Ambassador Leth was ancient by almost any standard. His species measured their long lives in centuries, and he had been a diplomat for the vast majority of his. He had deep blue skin that had gone gray at the edges, and eyes that moved with the deliberate slowness of a being who had decided, somewhere in his long history, that most things were not worth rushing toward. He read the packet with the expression of a man who had seen this before, who had, in fact, signed documents very much like this one before, who understood precisely where signing led and had made a long, careful calculation that the alternative was worse. He set the packet down. He nodded, very slightly. My stomach turned. I pulled up my own copy on my handheld display and moved past the diplomatic language to the appendices. The Varath were meticulous record keepers. I had always given them that. Their appendices included historical context, prior agreement references, and relevant data that other empires would have buried or omitted. They included it because they did not think it was threatening. Why would it be? The numbers only ran one direction. I found what I was looking for on page 11. Colony Registry, Voss Station, Outer Rim Sector 7. Population as of last Varath Administrative Survey, 0. I looked at that number for a long moment. Voss Station had not always been called Voss Station. It had been called New Durban when my grandmother helped build it, when she was young, and the outer rim was still a place where people went to start things rather than to lose them. 1,400 people had lived there, mostly farmers and technicians, and the kind of people who chose distance from the core because they valued the particular freedom of having actual ground beneath their feet and actual sky above their heads, rather than the recycled air and synthetic ceilings of a station. There had been children there who grew up thinking the stars outside their windows were something to reach toward rather than something to be afraid of. They had signed an agreement with the Verath 8 years ago. A reasonable agreement, a protective agreement. The kind that reasonable beings sign when the alternative is a Verath enforcement fleet sitting in geostationary orbit above everything they love, waiting for the calculation to complete. 2 years after that, the census came back with a reduced number, then a smaller one, then, eventually, the number I was looking at now. 0. I closed the appendix. I set down my coffee. I looked at High Administrator Venn on the screen, still talking in his measured and reasonable voice about mutual benefit and resource allocation and the importance of stable frameworks for long-term prosperity. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the way she used to describe the view from her workshop window, the amber light that came through the dust particles in the afternoon and turned everything warm, the way you could see the curve of the planet's surface from certain hills if you walked far enough out from the settlement. The smell she could never properly put words to that she just called home. 0. I refilled my coffee. The machine still produced something that had only a theoretical relationship to what coffee was supposed to be. I drank it, because the session was ongoing and there was still work to do, and I had understood for a long time that grief was not a thing you stopped to attend to when there was work. It was a thing you carried. You carried it, and you kept moving, and eventually the weight stopped feeling like something pulling you backward and started feeling like something pushing you forward. I had been carrying a considerable amount of weight. The Keth ambassador was preparing his formal response. The Solari delegate, Chief Mathematician Okoro, a tall and precise being whose species processed visible emotion in a register that most others read as cold, was running calculations on his display with the focused stillness of someone whose math was doing the feeling for him. The Branathi observer was doing what the Branathi always did, which was sit very quietly and wait to see which way the room was moving before committing to any position at all. 12 species, each doing their own version of the same fundamental thing, which was calculating how much they could give away this time without falling below some privately determined threshold of survival. I watched all of them. I watched the screen. I watched High Administrator Venn, who had not once in 6 years of these sessions looked at me as though I were anything other than a procedural requirement, a checkbox at the bottom of an agenda. That is the miscalculation, I thought. Not the one about the Dalari Belt, not the one about the 5-year extension or the colony worlds or the mining operations. The real one, the one that was going to cost them everything. The assumption, held by the Verath and apparently confirmed by everyone else in this room, that humans operated on the same compliance architecture as everyone else. That there was some arrangement of incentives and pressures that would eventually produce the same nod that Ambassador Leth had just given. They thought we calculated the way they did. We did not calculate the way they did. I opened a new document on my display. Not a diplomatic response. Not a formal objection for the session record. A memo to Commander Adler at the Human Military Coordination Office, marked low priority, routed through 3 relay stations so it would not flag standard communications monitoring. The subject line described it as a preliminary assessment of resource reallocation scenarios. It was not about resources. I wrote for 47 minutes while the delegates around me debated the finer points of access rights to the Dalari Belt, making the small, careful adjustments to language that would let each of them tell themselves, later, that they had gotten something. Outside the station windows, the stars were cold and still, and the distances between them were the same enormous distances they had always been, and somewhere out past all of that was a field of rock and soil and filtered air where 1,400 people had once grown things and watched their children grow taller and called it home. I finished the memo. I sent it. I drank the last of the coffee. I stamped the acknowledgement receipt on the incoming packet, which was the procedural requirement for my role, and I kept my face neutral and I let Ambassador Leth deliver the formal response on behalf of the Council, which was, as always, a careful and dignified version of yes. That was the day I stopped doing math their way. I did not announce it. There was no announcement to make. The decision was not a speech or a declaration or a dramatic moment that other people in the room would later point to and say that was when it changed. It was a private arithmetic, a reorientation. The moment you stop measuring distance from where you started and start measuring it toward where you are going. I walked out of the operations room into the corridor of Orion Station, which smelled like all stations smell, recycled and slightly metallic, and faintly of the thousands of beings who move through it daily. And I found a window, and I stood there for a moment and looked out at the stars. I had been patient for 6 years. I had been reasonable. I had sat in the observer chair and received diplomatic packets last and said nothing when there was nothing useful to say, and I had watched 12 species negotiate their own slow disappearance and called it diplomacy. I thought about New Durban, about the amber afternoons, about population zero. I had been patient long enough. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a different room with a longer table and worse lighting, and they were summoning me up as a formality. The Multi-Species Security Council had been convening for 14 hours straight by the time they called me in. The session was held on Relay Station 12, chosen because it occupied genuinely neutral territory, not inside Vareth jurisdiction, not claimed by any alliance member, not anyone's home ground. In practice, this meant the chairs were an uncomfortable compromise between 4 different body configurations, and served none of them well. The air recyclers were set to a temperature that left everyone slightly cold, and the table was made of a dark synthetic material that reflected the overhead lighting in a way that made every delegate look like they were operating on insufficient sleep, which most of them were. I walked in to find 11 delegates already seated and 1 empty chair positioned at the far end with a placard reading, Human Representative, Observer Status, Observer Status. Still, I sat down. High Administrator Venn had not come personally this time. He had sent a representative, Sub-Administrator Kale, younger than Venn by what I estimated was about a decade, with the same careful eyes and the same administrative posture, and the same sealed data packets arranged in front of him with the precision of someone who has already run the session in their head and knows how it ends. Kale had the polished certainty of a person who has been trained to be certain and has not yet encountered sufficient evidence to doubt the training. He was younger than Venn, but no less formidable for it. Certainty is a thing you can install in people if you start early enough. Ambassador Leth opened the proceedings. He did it with the grace of a being who has presided over too many sessions in rooms like this one, and has made a philosophical accommodation with the fact that they are all essentially the same session with different numbers attached. He was not warm exactly. He was dignified in the specific way of old things that have long since stopped expecting better, and have arrived at a kind of peace with that. He laid out the situation. The Vareth had expanded their position since the Orion Station session. In addition to the Dalari Belt operations, they were now presenting a formal request for navigation rights through the Sura Corridor, the primary transit route connecting the supply chains of 11 Sulari worlds to their manufacturing infrastructure. Without those rights formally granted, Varath Administrative Code would begin classifying Sulari corridor usage as unauthorized, which would trigger a series of enforcement protocols that everyone in the room understood perfectly well and no one wanted described out loud. In exchange, they were offering a 10-year non-interference guarantee for the 11 affected worlds. Okoro read the proposal. He read it for exactly 4 minutes without speaking or changing expression, which for Okoro meant he was computing something very large with a result he did not like. When he spoke, he said, "The probabilistic outcome of compliance at this level is a 91% reduction in autonomous Sulari operational capacity within 30 years. Souls." Kale's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees towards something that might have been a smile. "The probabilistic outcome of non-compliance," he said, in the careful translated tones of a being who has rehearsed this line, is considerably less favorable. Okoro looked at him for another 4 minutes. Then he looked back at his data. The room moved. I could feel it the way you feel a ship's attitude thrusters adjusting. Not dramatically, not with any visible announcement, just a subtle shift in the orientation of everything. One by one, in the practiced way of people who have done this before, who have learned to process capitulation as something other than what it is, the delegates around the table were moving toward acceptance, not enthusiastically, not without private calculation and private misgiving, but moving toward it, because the Varath had done this many times before, to many entities who had considered themselves better positioned than they were, and the historical record was not ambiguous. Ambassador Leth turned to me. Procedural, routine. He had done this before, would do it again, expected nothing from it except the checkbox completion. The human representative will now acknowledge the current terms as presented. I stood up. The room went quiet. Not the normal quiet of someone preparing to speak, a different quality of quiet, the kind that happens when the air pressure changes before the seal fails. I reached into my jacket and produced a single printed sheet, physical paper. I had printed it deliberately the morning before, because a physical document placed on a physical table has a weight and a sound that a data file transferred to a display never achieves. I set it on the table and slid it toward the center, where everyone could see it. Before I acknowledge anything, I said, I want everyone in this room to look at this page. Nobody moved to take it, so I described it. It was a list. 432 entries, numbered, with 2 columns. The left column was the name of every independent species, sovereign world, political coalition or self-governing entity that had entered into a formal treaty agreement with the Vareth Empire in the 4 centuries of their expansion. The right column was the current status of each entry. The list used 4 status categories: absorbed, dissolved, population 0. One entry, at the bottom, simply read, ongoing. That was the alliance. That was this room. I counted them twice, I said. Find me one entry on that list that survived compliance with the framework currently being presented. Find me one. I will wait here as long as it takes. The room did not erupt. People who have already made peace with difficult truths do not erupt when the truth is spoken out loud. They go still. They go very, very still in the way of things that have been holding a shape by force of will and are suddenly required to hold it harder. Okoro looked at the sheet. He picked it up. He put it down. He looked at Kale. Kale's slight administrative expression had not changed. He had seen this kind of moment before. He had the look of a professional who has been present when entities object dramatically and then, after the reality of their position settles, return to the table with modified language and apologetic smiles. He thought he was watching the preliminary phase of that, a principled protest, a moment of pride before the calculation completed. He thought I was doing what beings do before they realize what the numbers actually mean. I looked at that expression on his face. I had seen it before, in a very different context, a very long time ago. The small certain patience of someone who believes the outcome is already decided and is simply waiting for the other party to finish their display of feeling and arrive at the same conclusion. The specific look of a person who has learned that their position produces predictable results and has stopped imagining that any particular situation might be different. The smile, the slight, administrative, we both know how this goes expression. I had been across from that expression in schoolyards and briefing rooms and council chambers for my entire professional life, and every time it had carried the same message underneath the composure. This one will cost me nothing. It was a tell. I had learned long ago that it was a tell. Something settled in my chest. Not anger, something older than anger, and quieter, and more permanent. The thing that sits below anger, underneath it, that anger is sometimes built on top of. I picked up my sheet. I folded it once. I put it back in my jacket. I will not be acknowledging the current terms, I said. Not today. Not at any future session. Not under any reframing of the language, however creative. The room breathed. Several delegates shifted. Kale's expression held. He was professionally trained. He said, in the reasonable tones of someone addressing a temporary misunderstanding, "Sergeant, the human territorial position is not one that supports unilateral non-engagement with this framework. The practical and material outcome of your government's refusal to—" "I know what the outcome has been," I said. "For 400 years and 432 entries, I know exactly what the outcome of compliance has been." I looked around the table, at Leth, whose ancient blue-gray face was doing something complicated, not quite pity, not quite the edge of something else, but close to both. At Okoro, who was still running numbers, whose face never changed but whose stillness had shifted quality. At the Brenathi observer, who had finally stopped waiting for the room to show him its direction, and was watching me with an attention that contained nothing diplomatic in it at all. 11 species, watching. I said, "We are not going to comply, and I genuinely believe, that if each of you sits with that list long enough, you will begin to understand that compliance is not actually the option you think it is. It is the option that looks like surviving. It is not the same thing." I sat back down. Kale collected his data packets. He did it with the exact composure you would expect from someone who has been comprehensively trained for exactly this kind of situation, and he said the session would be continued at a future date, pending review of the human position by the appropriate coordinating authorities, and he left. The delegates talked for another 2 hours. I sat in my observer chair and said nothing else, because I had said the thing and the rest was not mine to say. You cannot argue people into courage. You can only demonstrate that courage is a thing someone is willing to have, and let them decide what that demonstration means to them. I walked out of the session into the cold corridor of Relay Station 12. The lighting in those corridors was the blue-white of energy-efficient utility fixtures, the kind that has no warmth in it at all and makes everything look very clean and very functional. I stood in it for a moment. Then I sent the second memo to Commander Adler. This one marked high priority. Subject line: "We are going to need a different kind of meeting." Outside the station windows, the stars were cold and still. I had a great deal of work to begin. We went in at 0300 station time. I want to say it felt glorious. It was mostly loud, and it smelled like burning polymer and cold recycled metal, and 2 of us had to crouch around a pipe fitting in the access corridor for 6 minutes, because a Varath technician had decided that was a good moment to do a routine walkthrough of that section. 6 minutes crouching around a pipe fitting. That is what the beginning of the real work looked like. Mining Station Cora 7 had been under Varath occupation for 17 months. Before the occupation, it had been a human-operated facility with a crew of 212, primarily contracted miners, systems technicians, and the small administrative and medical staff that any self-sufficient station requires. The administrative team handled scheduling, supply logistics, and the considerable amount of paperwork that mining operations generate when everything is running correctly. The medical unit doubled as the station's only dedicated social space on Friday evenings, where someone had set up a projection screen and a physical collection of old film discs from Earth, actual plastic cases with actual printed covers, and the crew had held what they called movie night every week without exception and argued every time about whose turn it was to choose. I knew this because one of the administrators had contacted me 8 weeks before the Varath came, requesting updated emergency safety protocol documentation. She had mentioned the movie nights in a postscript. She had mentioned that they were watching a comedy that week, something very old, something from before anyone on the station had been born, and that the sound system in the medbay was not adequate for the soundtrack, but they made do with what they had, and that making do had become something of a station tradition. Her name was Claire. I had never met her. I had no information on what had happened to her after the occupation began. That was the kind of thing I carried, one name among many, attached to a postscript about a bad sound system and an old film. My unit entered through the service access corridor on the station's lower ring. 7 of us. Lieutenant Danny Holt, who had been a chemistry and physics teacher on one of the Callisto colony settlements until the Varath began moving into the outer territories in a sustained way, and he determined that his knowledge of chemical processes had applications he had not previously considered relevant. Corporal Priya Sands, Titanport originally, who had grown up on 12-hour dock shifts in an environment where one miscalculated decision ended things without ceremony, and had developed the particular variety of steady calm that such environments either build in people or break them with. Private Theo Walsh, 21, from Ganymede, who had never in his life stood on soil that grew things from rain, who had joined the unit 6 months ago with a face that still carried the expression of someone who fundamentally believed that the arc of events bends toward working out. The others, Corporal Aaron Bell, who never said anything unnecessary and was therefore often the most useful person in any situation. Private Dara Osei, who had been a systems analyst before this and could read station schematics the way other people read directions. Private Nina Cross, who was the fastest I had ever seen at securing a position once it was taken. And Sergeant First Class Owen Marsh, who was older than the rest of us and had been in these situations before, in the years when this kind of work was still called peacekeeping, and who moved through tight spaces with the economy of someone who has been doing this long enough that it has stopped requiring thought. We were not soldiers in the way that history books describe soldiers. We had not been born into it, or trained from youth, or shaped by decades of institutional military culture. We were people who had run out of other things to be, people who had done the math the way the Varath taught everyone to do the math, cost versus survival, loss versus existence, and had done it for as long as they could, and had then stopped. The corridor was narrow and cold, and smelled like the specific metallic cold of Deep Space Station infrastructure, which is different from the metallic cold of a planet, and different from the cold of open space, and is its own distinct category of environment that you either get used to or you do not. We had all gotten used to it a long time ago. Our suits were set to minimal heat signature. Our boots had magnetic dampeners for sound reduction on the station decking. Holt moved point. He had this way of moving in enclosed spaces that looked almost slow, careful, deliberate, covering each angle before committing to the next step. That was in fact very fast when you measured it against how much he was actually accomplishing. I had watched people try to match his pace and fail because they were trying to move at the surface speed rather than the actual speed. I moved second. The Varath had stationed a garrison of 41 on Cora 7, administrative overseers, technical management staff, and a security contingent of 12 personnel. 41. For a station built and operated by 212. They had restructured the station's output to serve Varath supply chain priorities, repurposed the residential quarters for their own minimal occupation, and reallocated most of the operational spaces. I had reviewed the intelligence on the garrison 3 times in the 48 hours before the operation. I knew the patrol patterns, the communication check-in schedule, the location of each security post, and the response time between the central security station and any outlying position on the station's lower ring. The Varath ran their garrison security according to established doctrine, which was designed for a threat model that assumed the opposition would approach with some kind of formal challenge or communication before engaging. Their security rotations were timed accordingly. We came through the first 3 checkpoints in 11 minutes. The 4th was staffed by a single technician running a routine equipment check, which he did not finish. Holt handled it before I reached the front of the column. We kept moving. The Varath security doctrine was built on deterrence as its primary mechanism. You do not need a war footing on a station that has been compliant. You maintain a garrison that is visible enough to remind the population of the arrangement. You run standard security protocols, and you rely on the foundational calculation that no rational entity will initiate direct action against an occupied position when the response will be so disproportionate as to render the action pointless. This was a sensible doctrine. It had been reliable for 4 centuries. The vulnerability in a deterrence doctrine is that it assumes the opposition is performing the same cost calculation that you are. It assumes they are measuring what they stand to lose against what they stand to gain, and that a sufficiently unfavorable ratio will produce restraint. We were not performing that calculation. We did not stop. The Varath Field Security Commander found us on Level 2. His designation translated roughly as Field Director Orath Ven, and he had the look of someone who had been in this posting long enough to have stopped expecting anything to deviate from routine. He was moving toward us because he had received a query from the technician at the 4th checkpoint that had gone unanswered for 3 minutes, which was the kind of administrative irregularity that gets investigated through proper channels. He had not come as a combat response. He had come to follow up on a paperwork anomaly. He stopped when he saw us. He assessed the situation for a moment. Then he raised one hand in the formal position for a parley request. In Vareth military doctrine, a parley request in an active situation carries binding weight. Both parties halt. Both parties lower or holster any deployed equipment. Both parties engage in the established preliminary exchange that opens formal negotiation. This is a deep cultural and institutional value for the Varath. Negotiation is the architecture of civilization, and the parley protocol exists to create the conditions for negotiation, even in circumstances of direct conflict. Every species they had ever engaged with militarily had honored the parley request, because the alternative was to be seen as a species that did not negotiate at all, and no species wanted that designation. He raised his hand. We did not stop. His hand stayed raised as we moved past him. I was close enough to see his expression. It was not anger. It was the expression of a mind encountering an input for which it has no category. The specific blankness of someone whose entire operational framework has just failed to account for something. We reached the operations center at minute 19. Priya cracked the door seal in 4 minutes, using override sequences she had memorized from a maintenance manual, extracted from a different Varath-controlled station 7 months earlier, and apparently not updated since. The door opened. We went through. The 3 Varath technical personnel inside reached for communication devices. None of them made contact with the devices. None of them were harmed beyond what the situation strictly required. We had rules. Owen Marsh had been clear about the rules from the beginning, clearer than I had been myself, which was one of the reasons I had wanted him on this unit. Rules in situations like this are not sentiment. They are the thing that distinguishes you from what you are fighting against. We held to them. I moved to the main console. The operations screen was running the station's current administrative display. Status, resource output, inventory, supply routing, staff manifest, current occupation, and below the current data, preserved because the Vareth administrative system flags deletions and their overseers do not like anomalies in the audit record, the previous staff manifest. The original one. 212 names. I found Claire's name, Administrator, Level 3. Her emergency contact was listed as a woman named Nina, designated as Sister, with a home address on a colony in the Outer Rim sector. I looked at the name for exactly as long as I could afford to. Then I started reassigning sections. Operations Center, Forward Command, Coalition, Residential Quarters, Temporary Operational Housing, Level 3 Storage, Supply Depot. Holt appeared at my shoulder, even breathed, the way he always was after the loud part was over. Clear to Level 3, he said. Walsh has the secondary access. Sands has the communications array on blackout. Good, I said. You all right? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the screen. He saw what I had been looking at. He did not say anything about it. Mara. I said yes. He left it there. That was the particular thing about Holt. He had been a teacher. He understood the difference between a question that needed an answer and a question that needed to be asked and then allowed to sit. He did not require resolution from me. He required forward momentum, and I was capable of that. So we moved. We cleared the rest of the station in 40 minutes. The garrison of 41 was secured in the crew quarters, where they had retreated when the communications blackout hit, and the parley request went unanswered for longer than their protocol allowed for. Each of them was logged and processed according to the rules Owen Marsh had been clear about. None of them were harmed. All of them would be transferred within 48 hours. Field Director Orath Venn was still in the Level 2 corridor when I came back through on my final walkthrough. He had not moved from the spot where we had passed him. 3 secondary team members were maintaining the position around him, and he was standing very still in the middle of them, looking at the situation with the face of a person who has been well trained for many contingencies and is discovering for the first time that the list did not include this one. He looked at me. "You did not stop for the parley request," he said. "No," I said. "Parley protocol in active situations is a binding. We negotiate from the other side of winning," I said. "That is when we talk." He processed this. Not with anger. I want to be accurate about that. He was not angry in any way I could detect. He was genuinely trying to locate a framework. He had spent his career operating inside a system that had run reliably for 400 years, and the reliability of that system depended on certain foundational assumptions about how rational entities behave, and one of those assumptions had just been demonstrated to be incorrect, and he was standing in a corridor trying to figure out what that meant. "This will provoke a proportional response," he said. "You are aware of the scale of what the central authority—" "I am aware of the scale of what was done here before we arrived," I said. He did not have anything to say to that. I left him with the secondary team. I went back to the operations center. I sat down at the console. The screen was still showing the staff manifest. 212 names. I had been looking at that number in various forms for 6 years. In census records and administrative reports and the appendices of diplomatic packets. I had learned, somewhere in those 6 years, to carry it the way you carry things that cannot be set down, by making them part of the weight you walk with rather than the weight you drag behind you. I got to the medical unit on the allocation list. I held the cursor there for a moment. I assigned it. Medical unit, active operational status, priority restoration. Holt came back in. He had done a full circuit of the station and was satisfied. He stood beside me and looked at the screen. "That's the last of them," he said. "Good. Plan for station going forward? We hold it. We reinforce. Then we hold the next one." He nodded. He looked at the medical unit designation I had just entered. He looked at the 212 names. He said nothing. That was right. "We don't do monuments while there's still work," I said. "No," he said. "We don't. 17 months of occupation. 17 months of someone else's supply routing and someone else's staff manifest and someone else's numbers in the administrative columns. And now, as of 0449 station time on a Tuesday morning, Cora 7 was running a different set of numbers. Hours. Outside the station, the Varath response was already being calculated somewhere far away. I had not yet decided how to feel about that. I decided to feel useful, which was the feeling I had the most practice with, and which served the situation best. We had more stations to take back, and the night was young, and the work was just beginning to show its actual shape. 6 months after Cora 7, I received a formal complaint from the Keth High Council, 11 pages long, written in the elevated diplomatic register of a civilization that has been composing official documents for 3,000 years, and shows it in every clause. It was addressed to the Human Military Coordination Office and copied to all senior coalition members, and was time-stamped 4 days after our most recent coordinated operation had cut the primary Varath supply route through the Sura corridor for the 3rd time in 8 weeks. The core of the complaint was that our tactics were destabilizing. I read the word 4 times. Destabilizing. I let it sit in my mouth for a moment, the way you let a complicated flavor settle before you decide how you feel about it. Ambassador Leth had signed it personally, in his distinctive formal script, with the small notation at the bottom that indicated in Keth diplomatic convention that the signer considered the document important enough to warrant personal attention rather than delegation. I noted this. I also noted that 3 months earlier, through 2 intermediary relay channels that appeared nowhere in any official Keth diplomatic record, the Keth Home Fleet had made available a supply corridor that enabled us to reinforce our position at Cora 7 before the 2nd Varath response fleet could cut us off from resupply. Without that corridor, the Cora 7 station would have become untenable within 90 days. He was filing a formal complaint with one hand. He was keeping us alive with the other. I filed the complaint under Ongoing, which was the folder I used for everything that required acknowledgement but not immediate action, and I went to the Coalition War Room. The War Room was the operational center of the base we had established on a small independent station that had formally requested Coalition protection 8 weeks after Cora 7. The room had a central display table that showed the current strategic picture across the contested territories in real time: positions, supply lines, fleet locations, the slow-shifting geography of a conflict that was not organized around pitched battles but around the control of logistics. The picture on that table 6 months after Cora 7 was different from what it had been. Not transformed, not reversed, but different in the particular way that things look when the process that was going in one direction has stopped going in that direction, even if it has not yet committed to going in the other. The Varath were not losing. That was important to be accurate about. They still held the vast majority of their territorial acquisitions. Their fleet capacity was still formidable. Their administrative infrastructure across the subject worlds was still largely functional. By any conventional strategic metric, they remained the dominant power in the region. But they were no longer gaining, and they were spending resources at a rate that their analysts, if their analysts were honest with themselves, which I was not certain they were, would have had to acknowledge was not indefinitely sustainable against an opponent who simply would not pause long enough to be managed. The Varath operational cycle required a pause. Between securing a position and completing the compliance process came a period of relative quiet, the time during which the opposition assessed, communicated internally, reached consensus on whether resistance was viable, and ultimately came to the calculation that it was not. The Varath used that quiet period to consolidate what they had taken, prepare the next advance, and allow the inevitability of the situation to settle on the opposition like a slow tide. It had worked for 400 years because every opposition they had ever faced had needed that time. Every species, every coalition, every stubborn last-stand government had needed the pause to complete its own calculation. We did not pause. Every time the Varath consolidated a position, we were already in motion against the supply lines feeding it. Every time they set up the conditions for the compliance calculation, we changed the variables before the calculation could complete. We hit the routes they needed for the consolidation. We supported the independent systems that were still holding out, and gave them the resources to hold longer. We made every Varath advance more expensive than the previous one, not by meeting them in direct engagement, which would have been a different kind of conflict than the one we were equipped to sustain, but by ensuring that whatever they took cost more than they had budgeted for and produced less than they had projected. It was not elegant. It would not have been recognized as efficient by any military theorist who had studied the great campaigns of history. It was expensive and loud, and it left the kind of marks that take a long time to account for in the reconciliation reports. But it had a property that mattered more than elegance, which was that we could sustain it when the Varath could not sustain responding to it. Okoro arrived on the base in the 4th month. He came in person. He had started doing that, arriving physically rather than sending data, in a way that I thought was significant but had not asked him about directly. He sat across from me in the war room and put his hands flat on the table in the Sulari gesture, indicating that what he was about to say was final, calculated, and not being offered for debate. He told me the models had produced a result he could not fully account for. At current operational tempo, accounting for all measurable variables on both sides, the models projected collapse of Varath's central administrative authority within 11 years. Not military defeat. The Varath military capacity would remain significant for much longer than that. But the political and economic infrastructure required to maintain the empire, the administrative systems, the supply networks, the willingness of the subject worlds to continue functioning as productive components of the imperial machine, that would become unviable in 11 years. The subject worlds were beginning to calculate their own arithmetic. They had not started refusing yet, but they had started calculating, which was the step before refusing, and the Varath had never before had to manage a situation in which the occupied worlds were calculating and the external opposition was not pausing long enough to be managed. The primary uncertainty variable in the projection, Okoro said, is human operational continuity. I waited. Every other factor in the model can be quantified within acceptable parameters, he said. Varath logistics, resource expenditure rates, coalition support levels, territorial control ratios. These can be measured and tracked. But the human tolerance threshold for operational cost, this value does not stabilize. Every parameter I have attempted to set for it is invalidated by the field data within a standard month. There is no threshold, I said. Okoro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the model requires a threshold value to function. Then the model needs to be rebuilt, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. That is what I was afraid you were going to say. The Varath peace envoy arrived in the 5th month, and this time they did not send a formatted packet or a sub-administrator with a small certain smile. They sent a chief delegate, Senior Envoy Carver, which was the designation for an official whose rank placed them 4 levels below the central authority itself. He arrived with a full diplomatic support staff and a formal request for a secure session, which he got, in a neutral room on one of the relay stations. He was direct. I respected that. He laid the offer on the table without preamble: full restoration of all human territories, all occupied human stations, return to coalition administration, reparations at a scale that communicated genuine institutional investment in the offer, and a 50-year non-interference guarantee backed by Varath administrative law. He pushed the document across the table. Physical paper. Someone had decided this conversation required it. I read the offer completely. Then I read it again, not looking for hidden language or unfavorable clauses. The document was clean, straightforward, and in several respects more generous than anything the Varath had ever offered anyone. I read it because it deserved to be read, because it was the kind of document that someone had put genuine effort into constructing, and because I wanted to be certain, before I responded, that I understood exactly what I was looking at. It was everything we had wanted, before the first treaty, before the first signed compliance. Before any of the 432 entries on my list, if someone had put this document on a table 6 years ago, before Voss Station, before the census data came back with declining numbers, and then with 0, it would have been enough. It would have been everything. Carver watched me read. He had the face of someone who has carried a difficult thing a long way and is ready to set it down. I want to understand something, I said. When the central authority put this together, when they sat in a room and decided what to put on this page, what did they think would make us stop? He answered carefully. The offer addresses human territorial concerns at the highest level the central authority has ever authorized. What did they think we wanted? I said. He paused. Restoration of what was taken, he said. Security guarantees. Recognition of sovereignty. What was taken, I said, cannot be restored by a document. He waited. I looked at the paper, at the clean, generous language, at 50 years and the reparations figure, at all of it. You cannot give me back New Durban, I said. You cannot give me back Voss Station. You cannot give me back the 1,400 people who were there, or the 960 other settlements on my list that are sitting at population 0, or the way the light came through the dust on certain afternoons and turned everything amber, or the person who used to watch that happen from a workshop window. No document does that. No reparations figure does that. Carver did not answer. So we settle for everything else, I said. Everything else means the cycle ends. The machine stops. Not the military conflict, the 400-year architecture that produces population 0 as a predictable outcome and stamps it with a gold seal and calls it administration. He said, quietly, what you are describing is not a negotiable framework. No, I said, it is not. I folded the document once and set it on my side of the table. Tell the central authority, I said, that enough is a starting gun, not a finish line. He left. I sat in the neutral room alone for a while. The stars outside the window were the same ones they always were. Cold and still and impossibly far. Holt was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside me without saying anything for a moment. How did it go? He said finally. I thought about the document, about 50 years, and clean language, and the reparations figure, about the amber afternoons. There is no number they can write on a page, I said, that covers the deficit. He nodded. So, we keep going, he said. We keep going, I said. The work was not finished. It was not even close to finished. But we knew the shape of it now, and we knew we could carry it, and that was enough to move on. The notification arrived on a Tuesday. That felt right. The Varath Central Authority did not consult my schedule when it decided to dissolve. It happened when it happened, which was a Tuesday morning, station time, while I was sitting at my actual desk, in my actual office, on the Coalition base, doing actual paperwork, which was what I was doing most Tuesday mornings these days, because the war had turned into the kind of sustained operational reality that generates considerable administrative documentation. The coffee was better than it used to be. Someone had started a small trading arrangement with a colony supplier 2 relay stations over, and the ground beans that came through it were a genuine improvement over the dispensary standard. This was, in the daily texture of things, a meaningful improvement. Small comforts compound over time. The notification appeared at the top of my document queue, routed through standard Coalition communications, formatted with a case number and a timestamp, and a reference to the Independent Verification Commission that would be filing a formal confirmation within 30 standard days. Varath Central Authority, Central Administrative Council, operational status, dissolved. I read it once. I set down my coffee. I read it a second time, and then a third, because things of this scale should be read carefully and not processed at speed. Then I put it in the ongoing folder and went back to the resource allocation form I had been working on before it arrived. The form was for the new Coalition medical station being constructed in the Sura corridor, and someone had entered the wrong facility code in column 7, which would cause the supply requisition to route incorrectly and delay construction by approximately 3 weeks if I did not correct it now. I corrected it. I submitted the form. I sat back in my chair. Outside the base's main observation port, I could see the portion of the star field that corresponded, roughly, to the direction of the former Varath core systems. Nothing out there looked different. Space does not reorganize its visible geometry to mark political events. The stars held their positions. The distances between them remained the same enormous distances they had always been. The light arriving from those directions had left its sources years before any of this had happened, and it would keep arriving at the same pace regardless of what the Verification Commission filed. I sat with this for a while. The quiet was unusual. Not the quiet of waiting, a different kind, the quiet that comes after a very long effort, when the effort is over and the body has not yet been informed. The base went about its business around me. I could hear the normal sounds of an operational station, the slight hum of life support, the distant motion of people in corridors, the soft percussion of a facility that houses hundreds of beings all doing separate tasks that nonetheless amount to a single collective purpose. It was a sound I had gotten so used to that I usually stopped hearing it. Today I heard it. Okoro came in the afternoon. In person, which had become his default mode of communication over these past months, arriving physically instead of sending data, in the way that some beings develop unexpected habits when they are working through something that does not fit inside their usual frameworks. He sat across from my desk and placed his hands flat on the surface. The models were wrong about the timeline, he said. How far off? We projected 8 to 14 years, he said. It was 6 years and 4 months. The variable. Human operational continuity, he said. At no point in the 6-year operational period did the field data produce a declining trend line. At no point of escalated cost, at no intensification of the Varath response, at no material increase in operational difficulty, the data did not generate a threshold event. Every model I constructed assumed a threshold event somewhere in the cost curve. There was none. I looked at the observation port, at the stars holding their positions. I have been attempting to identify the mechanism, he said. In mathematical terms, what produces a system with no upper bound on operational cost tolerance? I thought about Priya with the plant on her arms and the unexplained sunburn, arriving with a plant and saying you should have something alive in here. I thought about Holt in the Cora 7 corridor asking are you all right and leaving the answer alone. I thought about Walsh at 21 with the expression of someone who believes things work out, and Walsh at 27 with something steadier than belief in its place. I thought about Claire's name on a manifest, the postscript about movie nights and a bad sound system. It is not tolerance, I said. Tolerance is enduring something you want to stop. That is not what it was. Okoro waited. When you have already decided that nothing is going to stop you, I said, the cost stops being a variable in the calculation. It becomes part of the shape of the thing. You are not tolerating it. You are moving through it. He was quiet for a long time. I cannot build a model around that, he said. No, I said. I do not think you can. The Keth tribute arrived 3 days after the dissolution announcement. 14 pages. Ancient ceremonial language referencing human endurance through mythological metaphors I would need specialist translation to fully understand. Beautiful document. Ambassador Leth had signed it in a hand that was slightly different from his usual diplomatic signature. Not degraded, not shaky, just different in the specific way of a signature that allowed itself some quality it had previously been holding back. I read it completely, appreciated it for the genuine thing it was, and filed it. The Solari sent a data packet. No ceremony, no cultural language, just a full economic analysis of the post-dissolution territorial landscape, projected stabilization timelines for each recovering world, coalition resource requirements for the reconstruction period, and a summary note at the bottom in Okoro's characteristic precise formatting. The recovery projection is proceeding faster than baseline models anticipated. The primary variable continues to exceed expected parameters. I sent back one line. Glad the math worked out. Priya appeared at my office door on the 4th day. She was not in uniform. She had taken a full leave period for the first time in over a year, and she had returned from it with a sunburn on her forearms and an expression that suggested something had happened that she considered private. She was carrying a small plant in a plain container, broad green leaves. Something that could theoretically survive in the variable lighting conditions of a station office. She set it on my desk. "What is this?" I said. "A plant," she said. "I can see that. For the office," she said. "You should have something alive in here that isn't you." She left before I could find a response. I looked at the plant for a while. It was very green. It had the slightly improbable quality of all growing things in spaces not designed for growing, the quality of life that insists on itself in conditions that did not specifically invite it. Holt sent a message from Callisto. He had gone back to look at the school where he had taught before all of this started, and to find out whether any of his former colleagues were still there, and whether there was anything left to go back to. The message was 3 sentences. The school was still standing and still running. They had asked him about returning. He was going to try. I wrote back, "Good." I meant it without qualification, not as a diplomatic sentiment, as a genuine response to a genuine piece of information. The reconstruction work filled the weeks that followed in the way that large, complex, necessary work fills time, completely, leaving little space for anything else, but with a different texture than the operational work had had. The operational work had the texture of moving towards something. The reconstruction had the texture of building something, which is related but not the same. Moving toward has direction as its primary quality. Building has patience as its primary quality. Both require endurance, but they demand it differently. The census work was hardest. Not the logistics of it, not the resource allocation or the coordination between the recovering worlds or the supply chain requirements for the medical and infrastructure teams deploying across the former occupied territories. All of that was complex but solvable, the kind of complexity that responds to organized effort. The census itself was harder in a different way. 212 names on the Cora 7 manifest, 432 entries on my list, the specific calculus of 0, across 963 locations. Each number had a texture, each 0 had a weight. And now, in the recovery period, the numbers were beginning to change, not dramatically, not overnight, but the trajectory had reversed, and the reversal required documentation, which meant I spent considerable time reading census data that was moving in the right direction and experiencing something that was not quite relief, because relief requires having allowed yourself to expect the possibility of a different outcome, and I had not given myself that latitude for a very long time. Owen Marsh stopped by on a Thursday, with a cup of the good coffee. He had figured out the trading arrangement with the colony supplier, and had apparently worked out a more favorable rate than the one we had been paying. He set it on the desk, noted the plant, noted the star chart on the wall, said nothing about either, and spent 40 minutes discussing the logistics of the reconstruction deployment timeline in the Outer Rim sectors. He was methodical and correct about everything he said, and he left when the relevant items were covered, which was how Marsh had always operated, and which I had always found more useful than almost any other quality a person could have. Dara Osei was leading the system's infrastructure assessment for the recovering stations. She sent me detailed reports every morning that were thorough enough to be useful and concise enough to be readable, which is rarer than it should be. In the reports, without editorializing or noting it as anything other than a data point, she tracked the restoration of operational functions to each station, and at the bottom of each report, she included a single figure, combined current population of formerly occupied stations. The number grew every week. Aaron Bell was doing something with agricultural development in the Outer Rim. He had apparently identified a window of opportunity in the Cora sector for establishing new food production infrastructure that would reduce dependence on supply chains from the core systems, and he had submitted a 12-page proposal to the Coalition Resource Committee with exactly the right level of supporting data and had received provisional approval. He had not told me about it. I found out from the committee meeting notes. That was very much like him. Nina Cross had taken a position with the Verification Commission, which was the body responsible for confirming the dissolution of Varath administrative authority across the subject worlds and establishing the legal framework for sovereignty restoration. It was precise, difficult, important work, and she was apparently very good at it in the same way she had been very good at securing positions once they were taken, with an attention to completing the task correctly rather than quickly, and a refusal to accept outcomes that did not hold. Theo Walsh came to find me the morning the Verification Commission filed its preliminary report. It was official now, in the formal sense that things become official when the right bodies have reviewed the relevant evidence and issued the documentation. He came in uniform. He was still in uniform most of the time, through habit and probably through something deeper than habit, and he stood in the doorway the way people had started standing in the doorways of my office, which was with their weight slightly back, waiting for something, not necessarily invitation, but some signal that the space was available. "Come in," I said. He came in. He looked at the plant on the desk, with the expression of someone noting it for the first time, processing it, deciding not to comment. He looked at the star chart. Old habit. We had all developed it. He looked at me. "Is it real?" he said. "The dissolution, the commission report. The Varath Central Authority has not issued an administrative directive in 19 days, I said. The outer systems have begun reorganizing under independent governance frameworks. The Verification Commission's preliminary findings are unambiguous. Yes, it is real." He nodded. He looked at the star chart for a moment longer. "What happens now?" he said. I told him. The recovery work, the census, the sovereignty frameworks for the recovering worlds, the supply chain reconstruction, the infrastructure deployment, the years of patient ordinary necessary work that follows any long effort and is in some ways more demanding than the effort itself, because it requires sustained attention without the clarity of direction that sustained action provides. "There is a lot of it," I said, "and most of it is not particularly dramatic. It is mostly forms and supply requisitions and personnel coordination and the kind of long-horizon planning that does not produce visible results for years." He was quiet for a moment. "What does it feel like?" he said. "Winning." He was 27 years old. He had been 21 when he joined, had never seen grass, had arrived with the expression of someone who believed things work out, and had replaced that with something steadier and less comfortable over the years between. He was asking me a real question about a real thing. Not the surface question, which was about the feeling of a strategic outcome. The deeper one, underneath it, which was, what do I do now with the person I had to become to get here? I did not answer what he asked out loud. You know what the hardest moment in a long carry is? I said. He waited. Setting it down, I said. Not picking it up, not the years in the middle. The setting down. Because by the time you can, you have been shaped around the weight so long that your body does not know what to do with the space where it was. He thought about this. So what do? He said. You find something worth carrying, I said. The recovery work, the census, the 40 worlds that need their infrastructure back, the 12 new colony ships being commissioned. All of it. You pick that up and you carry it with the same quality of attention you gave the thing before, and eventually your body learns the shape of the new weight and you stop feeling the space. He looked at the plant on the desk, at the star chart on the wall, at me. Okay, he said. It was the right word, not a declaration or a revelation, just a quiet, orienting toward a direction. He left. The office was quiet. The plant was very green on the desk. Outside the observation port, the stars were the same ones they had always been, holding their positions in the cold and the silence and the enormous distances, sending light that had started its journey years before any of this happened and would keep arriving long after all of us were gone. I thought about the new colony ships, 11 of them currently commissioned, one more awaiting final approval, fresh registry numbers, population estimates listed as projected, which was the word you used when a number was a future rather than a history. The first one was scheduled to carry 1,200 people, farmers and technicians and administrators and children who would grow up looking at different stars from different windows and would not know, not directly, not in their bodies, what it had cost to make those windows possible. Someone had sent me the safety protocol documentation for that ship 3 days ago, the standard package, routine review request. Column 7 had the wrong facility code. I corrected it. I submitted the form. I stamped the first page of the next document in the queue. I refilled my coffee. The beans were from the colony supplier 2 relay stations over. Someone had finally calibrated the grinder setting correctly. It tasted close to what coffee was supposed to taste like. Not perfect, not the way things taste in memory when memory has had time to improve them, but close, actual, real, close enough. No empire ever survived us saying enough, not one. We did not survive it either, not the version of us that had needed to say it. Something else came through the other side, something that knows the weight of the word, something that carries the specific texture of what it cost to learn it. We do not put that in the history files. We do not put it in the commission reports, or the formal tributes, or the diplomatic language of the reconstruction agreements. We put it somewhere harder to find and harder to lose. We put it in the next generation's bones. In the young man who never saw grass and is 27 now and knows exactly what he is carrying and why he chose to keep carrying. In the teacher who went back to Callisto to try to remember how to only teach. In the dock worker who brought a plant because you should have something alive in here that isn't just you. In the mathematician who is rebuilding his models from a variable he cannot quantify. In the diplomat who complained with one hand and kept us alive with the other, and whose signature changed slightly when he finally let himself breathe. In the 1,200 people on a ship with a fresh registry number, moving through the cold distances toward a horizon they cannot yet see, toward amber afternoons that do not yet exist, toward a home that they will build and call by name and teach their children to love. In the stamp on the first page, in the coffee that finally tastes close to right, in the work, there is always, always the work, and the work is the only monument that counts. Because monuments stand still, the work moves forward, the work carries something, the work says, we were here, and we are still here, and we are going forward from here. Enough, and then forward.